Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be looking at Season 1 of Heroes, a TV show that debuted back in 2006, which has now been buried and forgotten. But before we begin, I'd just like to give a big thank you to all of my subscribers. I have now reached the 100 subscriber milestone, and I'm really grateful for that. And I'm looking forward to reaching 1,000 in the future. It'll take a while, but I'm excited for that. And don't worry, there's plenty more content coming throughout the decade. So Heroes was built on the premise of ordinary people discovering that they have superhuman abilities, and they would use these powers not only to prevent foreseen disasters from happening, but they would also use them to overcome the struggles in their daily lives. But these powers, of course, also have their burdens, their downsides. You know, it isn't all sunshine and rainbows. The first season was a humongous success, both critically and commercially, and it led to 3 more seasons. However, these 3 seasons had declined in terms of quality. Reviews and ratings became progressively worse with each subsequent season. And that's largely due to the fact that the show's creator, Tim Kring, and the writers who worked with him on the project didn't have as clear of a vision for the later seasons as they did for season 1. The show had a formula that it kept recycling over and over again, making it feel like it was stuck in some kind of a limbo, if you will. It never really evolved beyond that. Characters acted out of character from time to time, especially in the later seasons. They introduced lore-breaking plot devices and things like that. The plots became more and more thin as the show progressed, and it just became convoluted and difficult to keep up with. You know, the more characters and powers and conspiracies they added, the more complicated it became. But that's just a brief history on the show itself. It did get a miniseries 5 years after its cancellation. Yes, it did get cancelled after season 4. The miniseries is called Heroes Reborn, but even that failed. I will cover that once I'm done with seasons 1 to 4. Not only did the show fall apart after its first season, but it even ruined the careers of some of the actors involved. And you may recognize some of these cast members as we go along. And with all of that being said, is season 1 really as good as people remember it? Well, yes, it is. It holds up remarkably well. I actually watched the entire show back in, March and April of 2020 when COVID started. And as a product of its time, it holds up well, despite the later seasons being rather disappointing. So let's talk about season 1. So first of all, I really appreciate the show's grounded take on the superhero genre, because that's what this is. It's a superhero show. It's just that it's a lot more realistic than what you'd expect out of the Arrowverse or Marvel's Netflix universe or the MCU or the DCEU. These aren't traditional superheroes. And as I've gotten older, I've grown to appreciate the more grounded takes on traditional superheroes out there, because these are characters with real life problems. And as you get older, life gets more complicated. And I'm no longer a teenager, so I can relate to this. This show emulates the aesthetic style of American comic books, specifically superhero comics. So if you've ever read a superhero comic in your life, chances are it'll enhance your enjoyment of the show. There's also some inspiration taken from 24. The TV show starring Kiefer Sutherland, because 24 had a literal ticking clock which gave it a lot of urgency, and the characters had 24 hours to prevent something from happening. And this show does something similar, except there's not necessarily 24 hours, but there's 23 episodes in this first season, and the characters in this season are trying to prevent an explosion from going off in New York. So it's the equivalent of a ticking time bomb scenario, much like 24. In other words, this is basically 24 with superheroes. Yeah, it's definitely my cup of tea. I also really enjoyed the storytelling in the show. You see, the writers were given individual characters to write, and Their ideas for these characters could be turned into individual episodes where they introduce each of the characters. They start off on their own and then eventually they meet up with other characters. Plus, these characters each have their own glimpse of the future in which the explosion in New York goes off. And this is what really ties all of them together. And there are other storytelling techniques that it uses pretty well, like the usual cliffhangers, clearly inspired by Lost and 24, the way that the characters discover their powers, and there's even a flashback episode at one point which kind of fleshes out some of these characters a little bit more and showcases what they were doing prior to the events of the pilot episode. Speaking of which, the pilot episode was just fantastic. It's one of the best pilots I've ever seen in my life. It did a good job in establishing most of these characters and giving us a general idea of what we're heading into. And now moving on to the actual characters. Are they likable? Do we care about them? Are they sympathetic? Can we relate to them in some ways? Well, yes, we can, definitely. The main protagonist is Peter Petrelli, who's played by Milo Ventimiglia, who you may recognize as Rocky Jr., Rocky Balboa's son, from two movies in the Rocky franchise, Rocky Balboa and Creed II. Peter is a hospice nurse turned paramedic who can absorb and mimic the powers and abilities of other people. It sounds cool at first, but unfortunately, he had absorbed way too many abilities in the later seasons to the point where his plot armor practically made him OP. But his journey throughout this season was fascinating. He is initially defined by his complex relationship with his brother Nathan Petrelli, who is a New York senator and is also very important to this season. He's very sensitive, caring, and compassionate, and he is often challenged by the choices that his abilities force him to make. Hayden Panettiere plays Claire Bennett. She is a high school cheerleader who has the ability of automatic cell regeneration. I also really enjoyed her journey throughout the season, and I wish the writers were more creative with her arcs in the later seasons. Speaking of Claire, there's a phrase that was used to market the show. Save the cheerleader, save the world. Remember that going in. You'll get used to it. Claire's father, Noah Bennett, is played by Jack Coleman. He is an employee of the Primatech paper company, and he's one of the best written characters on the show in my opinion. I always look forward to seeing him on screen. Ali Latta, who you may remember from the Resident Evil movies as Claire Redfield, Chris Redfield's sister, plays Nikki Sanders, and she has superhuman strength and a dangerous alter ego. Greg Grunberg plays Matt Parkman, a police officer who has the ability to read minds. Sendil Ramamurthy plays Mohinder Suresh, a scientist whose father spent years conducting research on superpowered beings, and Mohinder is continuing his father's research, and this is what draws him into the story. Zachary Quinto, who you'll probably remember as Spock from J.J. Abrams' Star Trek trilogy, plays Sylar. Sylar is the main antagonist. Before the Star Trek films, this was his breakout role. Sylar targets other superpowered beings in order to steal their powers for himself. And he's about as three-dimensional as any villain should be for that matter. Because initially he is well-intentioned. He wants to mean something, he wants to make a difference. But in the process of that, he kind of lost his way and he went a little bit crazy. And he's extremely intimidating, which I think all villains should be as well. But the real star of the show is Hiro Nakamura, who's played by Masi Oka, an extremely underrated actor who I wish had gotten more work after this. Hiro Nakamura is an office worker who has the ability of space-time manipulation, so there's a lot he can do with that. Unfortunately, recent events have prevented him from utilizing his abilities to their fullest potential. His entire arc throughout this season was brilliant. It was fun, it was exciting, and even though the later seasons were kind of underwhelming in terms of what they gave this particular character to do, they were still fun. And what I really enjoy about Hiro is that every time he's given a task, he always sees it as an adventure. and he's always dragging his best friend Ando with him. And you really buy these two as friends. And unlike most of the characters who see their abilities as a curse or a burden, he sees them as a gift or a blessing. He's grateful for them. And every time things are going his way, you'll often hear him saying, "Yatta! Yatta!" which means "I did it" in Japanese. And no, I haven't been learning Japanese, that's just something you hear on the show quite often. So yeah, he was my favorite character. Heroes had a budget of about $4 million per episode, leading to some really elaborate, for the time, special effects. They haven't aged as well as I hoped they would because this came out in 2006 and the show is made on a TV budget, but it's actually impressive compared to what other TV shows had to offer at the time. There's some fun action scenes thrown in the mix every once in a while. I mean, the show is kind of a slow burn, but it will still have enough action to keep you entertained. The musical score is one of the most unique musical scores in the history of television. It's dreamy, it's ghostly, and some pieces feature vocals from Al Shankar, who's an Indian violinist, composer, and vocalist. And the finale is one of the most exciting finales in television history. Apparently, Tim Kring, who created the show, wanted it to look like a $90 million movie, but the network wasn't having that, and they probably stuck to the usual $4 million per episode. Still, it was amazing, yet grounded in reality like it should be. Now, there's actually very little to complain about with Season 1 of Heroes. I'd say some of the visual effects aren't perfect, even for their time. And there's this weird thing that happens where some characters disappear and then other characters pop out of nowhere when the plot demands them to. It's a little too convenient if you think about it. But other than that, everything else is fine. So yeah, that was my review of Season 1 of Heroes. If you're able to find the show somewhere, do yourself a favor and watch the first season, but just be cautious going into the later seasons. So next time we're going to look at Season 2, but unfortunately this is the season that pretty much doomed the entire show. And it has to do with the right to strike to some extent. So thank you all for watching. Please be sure to like the video, share it and subscribe, hit the notification icon. Be safe during this time, and I'll see you soon.